Welcome back, everybody. It is your weekly dose of the Decline and Fall show. A spoonful of sanity helps the decaying imperialism go down, or so the song doesn't go. And joining me through this tour around the marbled ruins of the decaying US and British Imperium, as we stroll through the wreckage of concepts, ideas, and postmodern non-realities, it is our comrade, friend, and co-presenter hiding out in an undisclosed location in the once and future socialist Yugoslavia, Kit Clarenberg.
Hello, and on the subject of Mary Poppins songs that don't exist, I think a working title for this program is Supercalifragilistic Anglos are atrocious, perhaps. But yes, no, we have quite a bit to get into today. So Alex, let's kick off.
Well, we will start, perhaps unexpectedly, though, with a story from the always fun types in the German ruling class. Always people known for their calm and measured demeanor, or perhaps not. They have recently pulled something which is perhaps not entirely unexpected, but is something of a new development. This is, of course, the move by a shady organization known as the State Office for the Protection of the Constitution to effectively ban Marxist organizations as they violate the basic law of Germany, which is the German Constitution. Now, before I bring Kit in for his opinion on this, I'll just outline what this case is. This was a case brought against a small German reading group who were reading, I think it was Capital Volume 1, and the Office for the Protection of the Constitution brought a case against them to effectively ban them from doing so, to make their activities illegal, as the study of Marx violates the German Constitution. Now, the case was ultimately decided in the reading group's favor by the court in Hamburg, but it was done so on the basis that the group weren't militant and weren't organized enough to pose anything of a threat, meaning that if a group is judged to be militant enough that they pose a threat by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and by a court, then they can be rendered illegal, meaning that what effectively the German court has ruled is that we are now back in the period of like Tsarist Russia, but with a slightly higher degree of technology, and the Bismarck era, early Second Empire Germany, which is that you are only allowed to study these ideas in a dry and academic fashion. You are not allowed to try and apply the lessons of Marx and Engels, and by extension, Lenin, certainly Stalin, certainly Mao, into political organizations in Germany. Now, this may come as a shock, given that the Germany, of course, is the birthplace of Marx and Engels. It is the birthplace of course, what was once the largest avowedly Marxist party in the world, which was the German SPD, which still exists, though I think that it would be laughed at by Marx and Engels these days if they could see it. But this raises several interesting questions about repression in Germany. So, Kit, my first question to you, as someone who's written on this institution before, what exactly is the Office for the Protection of the Constitution in Germany, and what are its roots?
Yeah, sure. So, Bundesamt für the Verfassungsschutz, typically beautiful German. It's effectively Germany's domestic spying agency, and it is the kind of analog of MI5 or the FBI, say. It's much like West Germany's military and indeed its entire intelligence and security infrastructure. Its roots lie in a network known as a nexus known as the Galen Network, which was created by the British and Americans using high-ranking Nazis who were, of course, insulated from justice for their horrendous crimes. And now the I think that what's that I think particularly disturbing about the BFE is that the German authorities can. I mean, banning is one thing, but what German authorities often do, and this is what they've been they've done to the AfD, is they can deem groups to be subversive or contrary to the German constitution or extremist, and then this effectively opens the flood. It completely lets the BFE off the leash in terms of what they can do to spy on these people. Now, that means going through any member of a group's digital, personal communications, the communications of their friends and associates and family, and more. They also have a very dubious history of supporting Germany's neo-Nazi neo-Nazi movement in order to gather intelligence, which is quite remarkable, and it does raise the obvious question of whether the entire movement as it exists in Germany would exist were it not for the BFE basically bankrolling their activities. I wrote about this for the Grey Zone. I think it was in late 2022, but they have this very odd history of being in extremely close quarters with neo-Nazi groups, which in some cases carried out very serious acts of terrorism, bombings, murders, bank robberies, and in certain instances these were conducted by individuals or groups that were heavily penetrated by the BFV or were receiving funding for the BFV for information. So, they are, to say the least, extremely dubious, as, most Western intelligence services are, an extremely dubious element within German society. And I think the fact that their sweeping powers are, not a subject of controversy whatsoever, or subject to much in the way of critical scrutiny in the media, in the German media at all, is a testament to how servile the West German population is. But completely unsurprised that that communists and communism are now in its crosshairs, because this is something that we're seeing across Europe. More and more countries are following the Baltics lead and banning communism and displays of communism, while Mein Kampf can be readily bought in mainstream bookshops, and in fact is often recommended to people as a purchase. Yes.
Well, it's, again, not exactly a surprise, given that there is now a move against, as you said, communist organizations in starting with where the Baltics lead, everybody else apparently follows, which is rather disturbing given the terrible state of those countries. But it is no surprise that, given the extreme decay and extreme crisis that is now afflicting all of Europe, about which, by the way, more later in the show, so stay tuned. It is, I would say, no surprise that the thing they're moving to ban is anybody who effectively tries to use the philosophical methods of Marx and Engels to organize around. Because this, in my view, if Carl and Fred could see this today, they would laugh, because this is the exact kind of thing that those two men lived through their entire lives, which is banning, their works being destroyed, themselves being driven into exile. This was all done to them under the Prussians, who seem to be still somewhat the basis of the German state over 200 years later. This was done by, of course, Napoleon III. It was done across the various princely states of Europe, and then again by, of course, Bismarck. So this is nothing new. This is something which is done every time there is a serious crisis. But now I would say we're on a mega crisis, to coin a phrase, stemming from the 2008 economic disaster, which the EU, Germany at the center of it, has never been able to solve, and it's combined with a looming disaster in Ukraine, which the German political hierarchy are all implicated in. And so that they are preemptively moving to ban things or give themselves the power to ban things shows us just what a deep crisis that Germany is in. But I wanted just to clarify for the audience, there's something we mentioned earlier, which is that the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, as Kit mentioned, this was something that was set up basically by the Americans and the British using a foundation of ex-Nazi officials, which has nominally a liberal constitution, but which is essentially a strange hybrid of something which is created using extra, like, radical, ultra-reactionary German nationalists who sit sometimes rather uneasily under American and British domination, essentially. And this is what took over all of Germany in 1991. The reunification of Germany was not a coming together of two systems. It was one system destroying the other, with assistance, of course, of Gorbachev and the wretched Soviet leadership. So what you've got now is essentially a unified Germany, but it's a unified Germany based on a foundation of the holdovers from Nazism, essentially. Now, I don't like to agree with Andreas Baader very often, but for whatever one thinks of the Rote Armee Fraktion, the essential point that some of their founders made, which was common amongst the old West German revolutionary left in the 60s, was that the Nazi era had not been dealt with, that the roots of the FRG were growing out of the soil of fascism. And so that you have such an extremely reactionary state with this very thin liberal or sometimes social democratic veneer over the top of it, that this veneer fractures whenever there's a problem and reveals what Kit was describing underneath, which is an extremely reactionary police state, which is already running around banning and arresting Palestine solidarity activists. So that the communists would be next would be no surprise. Kit, do you have any final words on this story?
Yeah, well, I mean, a few things actually. I think that what is, I mean, I think that what, as you've kind of alluded to, I think that what really lies behind this push against communism, not merely in Europe, but specifically in Germany, is for many years, while Germany was to an extent economically prosperous, although of course the residents of the former East Germany were not beneficiaries of that prosperity to any extent whatsoever, and there is chronic underinvestment in the region. Unemployment is considerable, has since 1990 consistently been higher than in West Germany. Wages are considerably lower in East and West Germany, and it's suffering the the inevitable upshot of that, which is depopulation and all sorts of social problems, and this is one of the reasons that East Germans are voting for AfD in such large numbers. This is the former Die Linke, the left party's heartlands. They are voting for AfD not because they, for the most part, are far right Holocaust denying racists. It's because they have been systematically neglected, has their disrespected, and had their noses rubbed in it by West Germans for 35 years now. Now, yeah, while Germany was relatively prosperous in the 90s and the 2000s, it was quite easy for the state to dismiss or diminish the the high degree of positive sentiment towards life in the GDR by former residents of East Germany by simply dismissing it as quote unquote nostalgia, and suggesting that the people who missed full employment, a total lack of homelessness, and all sorts of rights and protections that they don't enjoy under capitalism, that this was because of some romantic view of what East Germany was like. So it was easy to malign that without taking, formal state action against socialists and communists. And also, a key part of Germany's kind of modern day mythos is the 1953 Berlin uprising. And there are numerous museums in Berlin and East Germany which tell a very specific version of what happened, which it kind of makes the comparisons with the Prague Spring, and it suggests the narrative is that these East Germans who were rebelling against communist repression, sought to yearned for freedom and rose up against authorities. What the official narrative doesn't mention is that these people were openly Nazis. And were flying swastikas as they attacked authorities. So that's certainly an interesting feature. And I might add that the German state, which is to say the successor of the Nazi and Anglo-American created FRG, they are bitterly determined that East Germany is not viewed positively by anyone. So, for instance, I think we mentioned some of her work on the show before. Katja Hoyer, who was born in East Germany and is now lives in Britain, and she's a historian. She is by no means someone I would consider of left possessed of left-wing politics, particularly in any serious way. But she wrote a book a couple of years ago called Beyond the Wall, which was a very sympathetic look at East Germany, which made the very obvious point that people were much better off. Like and indeed the GDR had its own economic miracle without a massive infusion of US aid, which was the driving force behind West Germany's economic miracle. It was all Marshall Plan US financing, and it was West Germany was pumped full of dollars specifically to demonstrate that that capitalism was a means to greater prosperity than communism. But Hoyer was viciously attacked. I think even members of the Bundestag went after her. They really hate her for having written a sympathetic look at East Germany. Bearing in mind this book was well reviewed in the mainstream media because of its balance and because of its excellent sourcing, and its all kind of alternative look at East Germany, because that for 35 years no mainstream historian has written anything positive about East Germany. In fact, the kind of go-to work on this is this god-awful book by Anna Funder called Stasi Land, in which she interviews 4 people who ended up on the wrong side of the Stasi, without often getting into details of why that might have been. Maybe because of their political leanings, and then extrapolates that to the whole of East German society, when it's completely unrepresentative of what the average East German experienced and enjoyed for 45 years until the wall came crashing down. I think that this is pretty much a nuclear option, but it's I think it does reflect the BFV going after Marxist discussion and reading groups is a reflection of what trouble the German state is now in. Because people are now suffering terribly, and they want alternatives. So neutralize those alternatives.
Yes. And
Sorry to interrupt you.
final point on this. I remember reading a while ago that like the German authorities or German intelligence services were actually behind the flooding of the former East Germany with fascist organizations post 1991, with the specific aim of doing two things: attacking and destroying any remnant of socialism in terms of like the working class organizations, and also promoting fascism as the only acceptable radical alternative. And this was an operation that was done throughout the 1990s, essentially, that the fascism was deliberately promoted by the German state, especially in the East, to push dissent away from socialism, Marxism, Leninism, towards fascism, which, of course, is all controlled by the German state. And this kind of operation, we've talked about it before in terms of how the British state does this a lot, not just with its pet fascists like Stephen Yaxley Lennon, but also with supposedly radical Islamic organizations as well. Every bourgeois state, every imperialist state has its collection of pet reactionaries who they push people towards, because that's a much more manageable way of soaking up dissent than having them go towards working class unity and actual rebellion. You give them a fake rebellion that they can indulge in. And I think that this is exactly what the German state has been doing for many, many years now.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, and just sorry, just to elongate this ever so slightly, I think what's important to note as well is that, like, one thing that I've personally been digging into the Helsinki Accords, which were signed on August 1st, 1975, and it effectively opened the floodgates for Western financing of anti-communist groups across the Warsaw Pact, like say like Solidarity in Poland, and Charter 77 in what was then Czechoslovakia. What's really interesting is that all of these supposedly anti-communist groups, they wanted to maintain socialism. And they viewed socialism as absolutely vital for justice and equality. They were not pro-capitalist, so they were in many cases these organizations were used as battering rams in order to take down the Soviet-backed governments, and then that they were discarded like a used condom when they'd served their purpose, and then right-wing reactionary forces started getting US and Western support.
Well, just to wrap this up, the things like Solidarity, I remember reading an account of it. Like all the discussions in Solidarity were about how to build a better kind of socialism. That was like the report from its internal meetings. And there's also undoubtedly the case that the Polish People's Republic had a lot of problems, which we haven't got time to get into now. But in all of the socialist countries, including the activities of like Gorbachev himself, it was all said to be about perfecting socialism. We need a better kind of socialism. We need a more democratic form of socialism. But of course, once the damage had been done, and once the breach had been made, and once the pro-capitalist forces had a firm foothold, all of that was gone, because the imperialists no longer needed that. They had what they wanted, which is that the system had fallen. So now you get capitalism with both barrels of a shotgun, basically. And therefore you end up with a depopulated, deindustrialized nightmare, such as Latvia or Lithuania or Estonia. And I think that the mention of the Baltic trio is an excellent point to pivot to our next story, isn't it? Which is, of course, the latest in what I'm going to call Operation Naked Emperor, which is the so-called peace talks that are upcoming in Alaska between a certain Donald Trump and President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. Now, before we get to that, though, it's important just to talk about the situation on the front line. And here I'm sharing an article from a military blogger by the name who calls himself Big Surge. But I'm sharing this because what this chronicles is that the situation on the front line in what was once eastern Ukraine, now western Russia, is dire for the NATO side, which is, according to not just those who take the pro-Russian point of view, but also according to like Ukrainian media, the military position is rapidly falling to pieces. They are, as the headline of this article indicates, they have been attrited to the point where they don't have enough men. The front line is falling to pieces because they have they're subject to constant pressure all the way along the line of contact by the Russians, and that the Russians are now making rapid advances, especially in the Donbass region, particularly around the final areas of Donetsk itself. Now, I will just switch to the deep state map just to show you the audience like what this means. So I'm just going to quickly switch to this. So you can see there the state of play. If you look down in the bottom of the screen there, you can see like an elongated red bit coming up there with 2 arrows there. That's all a rapid advance by the Russian forces just over the last week or so. And you can see thrusts here as well and up towards like Slavyansk. Now, Slavyansk is famous or infamous for being the place where there was like a 78-day holdout against incredible odds by the Russian ultra-nationalist, monarchist weirdo and sort of semi-genius in some respects, or great self-publicist adventurer Igor Strelkov back in 2015. So that's a big thing for the Russians. And what they seem to be doing is looking to make a military reality here, where essentially they've taken most of what was left of Donetsk that was in Ukrainian hands, and they're going to do it by the looks of it by essentially surrounding this area here around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, and then cutting off the Ukrainian forces and essentially presenting the West and Trump in particular with a fait accompli, which is, we've taken this much, your army's collapsing, we could take more, or there could actually be a discussion about ending this. Because, as multiple sources have said, there's now no real chance that the Ukrainians can conjure up the kind of armies that they had in 2023 or 2022. The Russians have effectively destroyed free NATO-organized Ukrainian armies. So this is desperate straits now for the NATO side. And so you get the meeting in Alaska, which has got all kinds of swirling bullshitting going on around it. But what this looks to be, according to my read of the situation, is that Trump is opening a dialogue with the Russians that will ultimately probably go on for several months until some kind of settlement has been agreed upon, even if it's a tacit one, whilst the Russians probably continue their military operations. There's some sources, including like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, report that Trump is going to ask for an immediate ceasefire. My read on it is that there's no way that Putin's going to agree to that, because if things carry on the way that this map chronicles, they'll essentially have a significant proportion of what their minimum demands by battlefield conquest. And there's nothing that Trump, never mind the British or the Europeans, can do about that. So, Kit, I'll throw to you for your analysis of the Alaskan summit and also the military realities behind it.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's been an enormous amount of speculation, both by independent and mainstream media, on the significance of, or lack thereof, of this summit. I am withholding to an extent judgment until it's over for a variety of reasons, not least because making predictions is a risky business. But on the one hand, yes, I think like it's very, very clear that the Russians have zero incentive whatsoever to make any concessions or to agree to the ceasefire, because yes, that would just allow Ukrainian forces to regroup or attempt to regroup. They are heavily reliant on foreign mercenaries now, and they are hanging on by the skin of their teeth to Pokrovsk, which is a key kind of strategic point, which leads to everywhere in Donbass. And once the Ukrainians are cut off from that, then they're not only pretty much screwed logistically, but also it's pretty much flatlands from from there on in. Without much in the way of defensive measures to prevent Russian advances. Yes, on the battlefield, Russia is winning. This is very clear. That there is nothing the West, very little that the West can do to prevent this, or even vaguely impede it. I think there's very little that that the West could offer Russia that would even make them make the decision makers contemplate a ceasefire. But by the same token, I do think that there's a lot of people who are suggesting that this is quite understandably they conclude, well, this is basically just pointless. I leave open the option that it could be the foundation of something significant, because I mean, Putin is not particularly given to meeting with Western leaders in person, particularly outside of Russia. That in itself suggests that the Russian president views this as important, if only just to have a direct conversation, or kind of start the ball rolling on wider discussions. But I also I have frequently made the analogy between Ukraine and Afghanistan in the way that Trump effectively negotiated U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan was by talking to the Taliban. The puppet government in Kabul was completely cut out of talks. They had no idea the U.S. was going to fully withdraw until it actually happened. But also European, Western, but primarily European allies were completely cut out of this as well. And the scale of the total and totality of US withdrawal from Afghanistan, they weren't prepared for or pre-warned about. There could be a parallel between Trump's talks with the Taliban and Trump's talks with Putin. Now, there have been numerous assurances made by Trump to European the ever needy and demanding European leaders. We'll get into that in great detail, but I don't necessarily think that there is, particularly strong grounds to believe that any undertakings or pledges made to them will necessarily be honoured. Until the meeting actually takes place on Friday, I'm withholding making what's the word? Substantive judgments or on its significance, or what it could ultimately lead to. But what it certainly isn't going to produce in the short term is a cessation of hostilities.
No, and there's no reason why the Russians would allow the NATO side to get up off the mat, so to speak, which is where they are at the moment. Now, the interesting thing to throw back to, and again, we find ourselves constantly going back to this, which is the purpose of the war and what each side sought to, or how each side sought to fight it. Now, I'm going to share this, which you found the other day, Kit, which is a blog by a guy called Robert H. Wade from the LSE, London School of Economics. This is from March 2022. And what this is argued, I think, quite convincingly in this article, which is by no means pro-Russian. In fact, the guy who wrote it keeps going out of his way every time he makes a substantive point to say, this in no way justifies Putin's illegal invasion, etc., etc., etc. Usual sort of academic, should we say, assurance against attack, should we say. Now, the disclaimers aside, now, what this blog points out, which is correct, which is that there was a move to essentially lure the Russians into a war in Ukraine. That this is something that the British and the Americans in particular, I think arguably the British in the lead, wanted to happen. And what they wanted was to lure the Russians in and then bog them down, hit them with all the sanctions, and then essentially a combination of being bogged down in what they hoped would actually be a long-running insurgency campaign, combined with the sanctions, combined with the activation of whatever assets that the Anglo-Americans had left in Russia itself. This was meant to cause the collapse of the Putin system. And it is worth remembering at this stage that people like Hillary Clinton, General Mark Milley, and others in the early stages of the Russian special military operation said they fully expected the Russians to conquer all of Ukraine in a matter of days, and that then they could begin what seems to have been their real desire, which is to then essentially turn Ukraine into another version of Afghanistan for the as it was for the Soviet Union, and by the way, for the Americans as well. And their deluded and ahistorical belief that the Afghan war led to a disastrous defeat for the USSR, and that led directly to the Soviet collapse. This is, by the way, historically completely inaccurate. We can get into this in another time. It's a very interesting story. But I'll just shortcut that now by saying that, in actual fact, by the time that the Soviet Union withdrew in 1989, there is a strong argument to say that they had actually militarily turned the corner on the U.S. side in Afghanistan by then. It was actually a calculated political capitulation by Gorbachev and Shevardnadze to essentially make a needless concession, along with many other needless concessions, to the U.S. That they basically sold out their Afghan ally and pulled out. Long story for another day. Needless to say, though, the mythological version of that is what powers particularly British, but also American imperial planners' thinking. And they wanted to do the same thing in Ukraine. In fact, they planned to. And this, of course, brings up the question of the role of Britain in all of this. And it opens up the question of, like, a show favorite and returning star of Decline and Fall, a certain Mr. Chris Donnelly, and his role in the planned guerrilla war, insurgency, terrorist campaign that they wanted to run. So this war, to conclude my contribution on this war was not meant to go this way. It was not meant to turn into a full-scale industrial war in the east of Ukraine or the west of Russia. It was meant to be an insurgency. The Russians were meant to be lured in, take all of Ukraine, the Kiev regime gets knocked over, and then the Europeans and the Americans and the British can mastermind an ongoing terrorist insurgency, which would be very costly for the Russians to try and get control of, and ultimately they hoped would trigger regime change in Moscow. It was not meant to be this. because they can't sustain this, which leads us back to the point of the talks between Trump and Putin. None of them can sustain industrial warfare. So they were trying to avoid that, just as the Russians were trying to avoid getting caught in the trap, which is, again, what produced the unique set of circumstances called the special military operation. But Kit, I'll throw to you for your analysis of like the purpose of the war and how it was not meant to be this way. What's your analysis?
In before the shelling started, like days before, there were high-level meetings between Russian and Ukrainian officials where Russia demanded that Kiev implement Minsk, and the Ukrainians refused because they wanted Russia to designate itself a party to the conflict rather than a mediator. Now, this is a crucial distinction because Russia's status as a mediator to the conflict reflected the fact that it wasn't a Russian invasion that began in 2014, but a brutal crackdown by Western-backed fascist elements against the Russian-speaking population of Donbass. Now, had Russia acquiesced and designated itself as a party to the conflict, this in itself could have kickstarted a proxy war. And it is clear from from my perspective, fairly clear from the leaked emails of Gwydion Prince, in which he is a long-standing British Ministry of Defence apparatchik. He in discussions with Chris Donnelly at the very start of February. Chris Donnelly, friend of the show, someone we've spoken about a lot. Donnelly refers to himself as being heads down in Ukraine. Now, was he heads down on trying to find a way to kickstart war? Was that what he was concerned with? It's a very obvious open question that arises. Yes, ever since from the second that the proxy war did erupt, he has been leading Britain's proxy war strategy, trying to endlessly escalate this and trying to get the Americans more deeply involved, which again has backfired pretty spectacularly. And in the process, Britain has borderline disarmed itself. It's almost bankrupted itself. I've reported on leaked documents related to the operations of Project Alchemy, which is the secret Ministry of Defense run military and cell, where they openly admit that the sanctions on Russia are hitting British citizens in the pocket. They openly admit that that the war is contributing to Britain's cost of living crisis, but they're determined to keep Ukraine fighting at all costs. Despite this,
well, yes, and also this is a point we've made before. It's that they can't afford to continue the war, but they also can't afford not to. For the purposes of British ruling class interests, the collapse of Russia must be brought about. Now, this, of course, turns us back to the summit, and I turn the viewers and listeners' attention towards a tweet you put out the other day, which seems to be that the British, including possibly the aforementioned Mr. Donnelly and his friends, seem to be organizing another suicide run for Ukrainian forces up into the Russian region of Bryansk, with the belief that it would seem that if they can do that, any talks between the US and Russia will be scuppered. Does raise a rather interesting question, though, which is that clearly the Americans have a certain influence over the intelligence and military apparatus inside Ukraine. But also, clearly, the British do as well. And that this isn't always pulling in the same direction. There are multiple different factions in Ukraine that are controlled by or close to different elements within Britain, within the US, also the Germans, also the French will be in there as well. So there's by no means total unanimity here. And if you believe the reports that come from the Russian side, what is assembling in the borders near Bryansk is a group of largely mercenaries for a lot of which come from Central and Southern America, and with an odd and motley collection of armored vehicles and the usual sort of saturation coverage of like Ukrainian FPV drones, which will only result in another disaster akin to Kursk, which cost the Ukrainians an absurdly high casualty amount, and also another disaster potentially like Krinky, which we've talked about before. But this is the only move they've got left, and this is essentially what the British plan amounts to, which is, well, we'll just keep the war going at all costs, and doesn't matter if the whole thing carries on for another 5-6 years, because the only thing that matters is essentially making it look as if this could still come out as a win, even though everybody knows it's not going to now. Everybody knows it's failed, but they will continue to shove Ukrainians into this particularly horrendous meat grinder for or indefinitely if they possibly could. But the fact is that there's simply not enough Ukrainians to go round anymore. And that's why they're having to rely on like Colombian, Brazilian, and other nationalities to bulk out the ranks of this sort of mercenary army that they've got roving around Ukraine now. And really, it's just a matter of when the Russians choose to end this and not if, which actually takes us over to our final point, which is that the Kiev Independent, again, a pro-regime Kiev regime newspaper, has reported that, as you said, Pokrovsk, which is a key defense point, is collapsing, and the Russians are like running forward into the rest of the Donetsk Oblast, meaning that whatever Trump says tomorrow, essentially, it could not matter at all, because the Russians will take what they want on the battlefield. Now, just to conclude on this point, the Russian thinking seems to be that they don't actually need to go for like vast land acquisitions inside Ukraine. They already have most of the economically productive areas of the former Ukraine under their control. So the mining, the steelworks, certain elements of shipbuilding, most of the allegedly Ukrainian possession of rare earth metals, that which does exist is mostly in the old east of Ukraine. The west of Ukraine and the central part of Ukraine, let's just assume for a moment that the ultimate deal is that the Russians essentially take what they've got now plus the rest of Donetsk and then leave it at that. Well, what is left of that Ukrainian state is a deindustrialized, depopulated nightmare. Those refugees that went both to Russia and to the West aren't coming back into the non-Russian parts of Ukraine, because it's a ruined state that is heavily indebted to the European Union and the US. Those debts, by the way, will not be forgiven. They will be held there and traded on the markets, as debts always are these days. Also, what's left of the productive farmland has all been sold to Monsanto, BlackRock, Vanguard, and others. So you've got a beggared state, heavily indebted, owned by various different transnational corporations based out of Wall Street and the City of London. And you've got a depopulated place which most of the adult male population is either dead, wounded, or has fled elsewhere. So even if the Kiev regime is allowed to survive post whatever deal the Americans and the Russians reach, it will be an unstable nightmare which will likely be unable to be stabilized, which will collapse within a few years anyway. This is probably the Russian thinking, but I'll throw to you, Kit, for your take on that potential future situation.
Well, yeah, absolutely, and I think it's precisely because Ukraine is in such like a desperate position that the prospect of another quote unquote counter invasion is quite possibly high. Because I mean, and this is, I mean, something that struck my eye, that was published a couple of days ago, was the Washington Post. It published this for no apparent reason. published this post-mortem on Kursk, which, while acknowledging it was a total disaster and it was launched in the hope that Ukraine could seize territory, it could trade in negotiations, and that failed. The Washington Post also somehow concludes the effort laid bare Russian weaknesses and unpreparedness. So could be foreshadowing of yet another pop at this. But yeah, that operation, as with all of Ukraine's biggest military disasters, in particular Krinky and the 2023 counteroffensive, was planned and encouraged by the British, using British supplied weaponry, and yeah, it was a total and complete disaster. Interestingly, in March, when the New York Times published that quote unquote expose on intimate US involvement in the Ukraine proxy war, which was not news to anyone who's actually been following this seriously, it very interestingly had a passage which suggested that the CIA got was forewarned, not directly by the Ukrainians or the British, but just by monitoring what the Ukrainians were doing, that they were planning an incursion into Kursk, and that the Ukrainians were explicitly warned, reportedly, by the US, that if you do go for an invasion of Russia, you're going to be on your own. Because they knew it was going to be a disaster and also potentially lead to a significant escalation from Russia. But again, that we have talked at length at how British military strategy, if you can even call it that, in this conflict, is heavily informed by complete fantasy, Hollywood, boys' own, not the Irish pop band, conceptions of World War II. Krinky was meant to replicate D-Day, and it was hoped that these British trained Marines, who were sent in wave upon wave to almost certain death, without air cover, without supplies, for 9 months. It was hoped that they would march on Crimea and outright victory in the war. But I think that the reality is that even if they do go for this in an invasion, and even if they don't, the reality is that Ukraine is just completely wrecked at this point. Like as we've discussed previously on the show, I think, the Ukrainian government, which is of course not known for issuing remotely accurate figures on anything, has admitted that 40% of Ukraine's working population has been lost one way or another due to the conflict. That figure is probably even higher. Ukrainian losses could be, it could exceed the 1 million mark. Economically, it's absolutely ravaged. Its infrastructure has been destroyed. Its resources, the resources which aren't in Russia's possession, are all owned by Western corporations. And even then, again, as we previously discussed, there was a much heavily promoted in advance Ukraine recovery conference that basically was just ignored by the media, at which a literal red carpet was rolled out for Zelensky, and Ursula von der Leyen said, we're going to support Ukraine militarily, politically, financially for as long as it takes. And there were other European leaders who made similarly bombastic pledges. And then the conference fizzled out with vague promises to drum up $3 billion in private investment for Ukraine, when the World Bank estimates that the total reconstruction cost of the damage inflicted by the proxy war is over $500 billion. So I mean, it's the longer this goes on, and I think that Russia Russia is intensely relaxed about keeping this going, and even the Ukraine Ultra journal, the Daily Telegraph, recently published an op-ed in which one of its commentators, no doubt begrudgingly, admitted that the sanctions had been a complete disaster, hadn't had the desired effect on Russia, and Russia can keep this going for as long as it likes. Like in a sense, they've already won, and there is very little point beyond for perhaps historical reasons, the wishing to reclaim historically Russian territory such as Kharkov or Odessa. They have very little incentive to make massive land grabs, because there's not really anything left. It's not it's not like a Battle of Berlin situation where there's going to be street fighting over Kiev. Just to finish this point, I think that like the deployment of Azov to Pokrovsk is particularly notable, because that they are, as we've again discussed past them, the for the most part, conscripts are being just endlessly fed into this meat grinder. The Azov Corps, who are the people who are effectively protecting Zelensky, although they have made clear that if Zelensky does see peace or make any concessions, well, that's the end of him. In the nastiest way imaginable. These are forces which are A, battle hardened, B, considered the kind of elite of what remains of Ukraine's military, and they've been diverted. And some have been held in reserve specifically to prevent Russian advances on major cities. They are being thrown at Pokrovsk because, once that falls, then it's not going to take very much for the remaining portions of the 4 oblasts that now, are now part of Russia to be just fall into Russia's hands without much in the way of a fight.
Yes, and also, like, why bother going and besieging places like Kiev and Odessa when you can wait a couple of years and then what's left of the Kiev regime will most likely implode due to indebtedness, economic failure, and the lack of interest of the Americans in investing in it, and the inability of the Europeans to revive it. It'll most likely collapse in on itself anyway. And the odds are that a government will emerge which is at least neutral towards the Russians and won't go for NATO, meaning you've achieved everything you wanted without needing to engage in a protracted and difficult siege of Odessa and Kiev. So essentially, you can keep what you've got now and then have a government which is either neutral or oriented back towards Moscow again, because of the way in which that the current regime is left dangling over the edge of total disaster and will plunge over it at some point soon. Now, to shift, talking of dangling over the edge of total disaster, the question of Europe emerges. And the question of what the hell happens to the European Union now, having staked everything on this on this war being a success and being able to collapse the Russian state or reimpose Yeltsinism. So allegedly, Trump has agreed on red lines before the Putin summit. I think what this actually was is Trump telling a bunch of European leaders what they wanted to hear. Zelensky now seems to be dressed as some sort of nightclub bouncer from Manchester in the mid-2000s with similar habits. Right? So Trump had probably placated these losers by telling them what they wanted to hear. But Trump has also said that there will need to be a follow-up summit with Putin. And essentially what this, I think it means, is the start of a process between the US and the Russians directly, which will end when the Russians want it to end. And it's probably much more about the US trying to create their relationship with the Russians post-war, rather than agreeing some kind of comprehensive settlement, because the Russians will impose their own version of this, militarily speaking. The Europeans are essentially being told to fuck off. Tell them what they want to hear, but sideline them. Zelensky is also being sidelined. This loser on screen right now, which is, of course, a certain Sir Keir Starmer. Remember, his father was a chisel and his mother was a hospital. And that's something we should always bear in mind. The is now on screen, sort of burbling away because he's got a summit with Zelensky today. But the truth is that they could all be made irrelevant by this entire process and left essentially, to quote a line from the JFK movie, left with their dicks in the wind. So, Kit, what's your reaction to the naked European emperors being revealed for what they are?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think like I kind of hinted at this hinted at this earlier, but it's like, yeah, I think that it is very it is very clear that yes, that the Europeans are basically shitting themselves, that Trump is, could cut a deal with Putin, which doesn't factor in any of their concerns or wishes whatsoever. But if this is finished on the battlefield, which would probably be Russia's preference, none of their concerns are going to matter anyway. But I mean, what another aspect to this, which the mighty Arnold Bertrand, who we need to get on the show sometime, I think, for a chat. He's made the point that, look, well, I mean, irrespective of the significance of Trump's talk with Trump's face-to-face meeting with Putin, ultimately these are two leaders meeting outside of Europe to potentially discuss the future of Europe, or at least matters with enormous bearing on Europe, which should tell you something about how the Europeans are actually viewed by the US. I mean, Trump has a history, both in his first term, but particularly so in his second term, of making derisory comments about Europe, the EU, and European leaders. The recent deal, quote unquote, that the US cut with Europe was completely one-sided, and amply demonstrated how the vassalage of European governments to US power. So I mean, yes, it has been reported that Trump has assured the Europeans that any territorial issues will be decided with Zelensky, and yes, that any deal will have security guarantees for Ukraine. And that yes, that Trump has sought to allay the fears of people like Macron and Starmer. I mean, if he sticks to his word, then that means that fighting will continue. But I mean, is Trump particularly known for consistency? Or keeping his word on anything. I mean, he has fluctuated on Ukraine on a pretty much daily basis since entering office, and ultimately, if he betrays his commitments to the Europeans, what are they going to do about it? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's nothing they can do. Europe is not economically independent. Is certainly not militarily independent, and they have even under Biden, who was the Biden administration was very, very keen to big up that kind of Western unity, like on Ukraine. It was abundantly clear that the negative impact on the war on Europe was of zero consequence to them whatsoever. I think that Biden even at one stage publicly stated, well, yeah, those sanctions are going to hurt the Europeans over the winter, but they're just going to have to suck it up. And it's like you know, like, so I mean I really yeah, I think that you know, when it comes down to it, I mean, what's going to happen if a deal is cut without European involvement? Macron going to, you know, whine to his wife? But he promised us.
Well, I mean, it's something that I think we'll obviously come back to in more detail as this story evolves. But just at this point, I think it's worth emphasizing like the subtleties of language here, which is that if we look at the latest from the NATO website itself, for instance, where they say that they will never recognize Russia's illegal and illegitimate annexations. Now, this is where I'm grateful for my British civil service training, because language matters a lot. You can not recognize something, you can declare it to be illegal, but it doesn't mean you're going to do anything about it.
Mm.
That's the thing. So they can say, when this war comes to a conclusion with what I think will be a tacit and perhaps unspoken agreement between the Americans and the Russians over the line of control, the NATO and the EU leaders can say, we do not recognize this. This is illegal. This is awful. Some American senators will undoubtedly say it as well. But look at the words. We won't recognize it. That means nothing, because it's not attached to any meaningful action, nor can it ever be. The only thing that they can possibly do when the Russians force this to a conclusion is try to launch terrorism operations and spy games, insurgency shit. The stuff, by the way, that MI6 and the CIA did in Chechnya 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that's their only move. And that's what they will do. They will not be able to, even in 5 years, even in 10 years, even in 20 years, because God knows if the European Union's even going to fucking exist in 20 years, or NATO, they will not be able to mobilize an army. They will not be able to rearm Ukraine. They will not be able to have the kind of Ukrainian armed forces that existed after 2015 in 2022 and 2023 and into early 2024. All of those men are dead or wounded. All that equipment's gone. It can't be replaced. So the NATO can issue all these statements, but it can't do anything. It can't go after the Russian line of control. The line of control, when it is established, will be probably one of the most heavily fortified areas in the entire world. The Russians will keep a significant amount of troops there. They will probably have to expand their army to do so, but also it will be something which becomes borderline impenetrable without a massive armed force, which the Americans don't have the motivation to put together and can't, and certainly the British can't, and certainly the weakling morons that run France and Germany can't either. And by the way, Hungary won't be interested in being the cannon fodder for that. The Romanian population isn't interested, even if the idiots that they've got running Romania as a stooge regime are interested. Bulgarians, same thing. Poles, for all the hyperventilating and proclamations of certain Polish nationalists, heavy inverted commas, and liberals, Polish population won't be interested in doing that. So this is basically an admission that we're coming towards the end. Now, just to pivot to the next part of this equation, shall we say, and to go over to the post of Arnaud Bertrand, who covered on his Twitter this week and on his Substack the fact that Besant, who's I think a hedge fund guy turned Treasury Secretary, essentially is going to treat all collective wealth of the NATO bloc and beyond that is able to be controlled by the US as essentially a giant sovereign wealth fund for the United States. Now, this is, again, something which has been an issue going back a long time, going back all the way, in fact, to the latter period of the gold standard, because when the French under de Gaulle and the British suddenly asked to see the gold that they kept in Fort Knox, that's when Nixon threw a shit fit and decided that the gold standard was finally going to be brought to an end, probably because it wasn't there anymore. And also, this is why Trump's promised audit of Fort Knox never happened and never will, because it is the gold just simply isn't there anymore. It's all gone somewhere, God knows where. So plundering the Europeans is something that the US has done before to an extent. But and again, this comes back to like the American liberals' opposition to Trump. It's that he and his gang are just crude enough to say openly what Biden and his group were doing quietly, which is that if we can't get the wealth from anywhere else, well, then we'll scalp our so-called allies. A reminder to viewers and listeners, the Americans built up West Germany, as we said earlier, and Japan into industrial powerhouses. They then scalped Japan in the mid-1980s with the Plaza Accords, caused a recession, and then essentially stole loads of high-tech production from Japan and shipped it to the United States. Same is being done with the Taiwanese chip building and manufacturing industry, the TSMC, I think it's called, the Taiwanese manufacturer, who then got told basically, well, you're going to build a new plant in the United States now. Same is true of all these allies. Again, heavy inverted commas around the word allies, that the US built up when it was in their interest to do so, when they were facing the socialist system of the USSR and the people's democracies. Now, when they weren't, then they didn't need that anymore. They get completely screwed and essentially asset stripped. So they're now going to do this to Europe, the thing that they have done to Japan, the thing that they are doing to Taiwan. It's now coming home. And this points to an end game here for NATO and the EU, I would argue. Kit, what's your read on this situation?
Well, yeah, I mean, it just again, there is, for all of the yes, like mainstream reporting on the assurances of supposedly given by Trump to European to European leaders about what he will and won't do in Ukraine. You only have to look at the public statements of Trump and the people around him to discern the total contempt with which Europe is viewed. Now, Michael Hudson, I believe, when Germany imposed sanctions on Russia, when at the very start of this, he wrote an essay. I think it was called "The U.S. Defeats Germany for the Third Time." Because in effect, like Germany was prior to this, an independent, to an extent, an independent economic power, although that was completely dependent on Russian. Cheap Russian energy, which they voluntarily cut themselves off from, and have since made clear that they will never ever again accept unless a acceptable leader is in charge in Russia, and therefore the energy suppliers suddenly become guilt free. But yeah, it has not been covered with any particular seriousness in the Western media. But an enormous amount of major industries, entire industrial sectors, employing thousands and thousands of people, are fleeing Germany, and in many cases they're setting up shop in America, in the US. I don't necessarily subscribe to the view that this was, a deliberate kind of codified strategy, but it seems to have worked out very, very well for the US. And I think that we are so far away from if we go back, like, say, 20 years, when, of course, Germany and France were openly opposed to the Iraq War, and were viewed as independent powers. That's all gone now. Any illusions about European kind of prostration to the US have been comprehensively shattered, and this is being increasingly acknowledged, in a way that it never was before, at least in my lifetime, by some mainstream commentators, because it is so unambiguous. I mean, as on our notes in this post, even the Fox News host interviewing Bessent, Fox News basically being Trump TV, it seems shocked by what Bessent is saying, and is referring to this strategy or policy or whatever you want to call it as offshore appropriation, which is to say theft. That's pretty extraordinary, and and again, it goes back to what I said earlier, which is the commitments or undertakings made by the Trump administration to its quote unquote European allies are effectively worthless. They will be readily reneged upon if the US deems it necessary. The official position of NATO, the official position of NATO is whatever Trump says. It is led by Mark Rutte, who, as I noted before, gained some prominence during Trump's first term because he had a kind of a very Dutch public dispute with Trump over striking a US-European trade deal, and he suddenly became a darling of anti-Trumpers, and then now he's calling Trump daddy. And as we've discussed before, Rutte, I think last year, said Ukraine's NATO path is non-negotiable, and Ukraine is absolutely going to become a member. And then earlier this year, he said, "Well, we never ever said that that Ukraine was going to join NATO for sure."
Well, they've always danced back and forth on that, and here's Mark Rutte himself trying not to tie himself up in too many knots. So let's just play this clip.
The infrastructure in Ukraine, so many people losing their lives, so much damage being done. And clearly, these two big issues have to be on the table. One is territory. And we have to acknowledge at this moment that Russia is controlling some of Ukrainian territory. And the question will be how to go forward past a ceasefire, including what it means in terms of security guarantees for Ukraine. And let me add one important aspect here. When it comes to this whole issue of territory, when it comes to acknowledging, for example, maybe in a future deal that Russia is controlling de facto, factually, some of the territory of Ukraine, it has to be a factual recognition and not a political de jure recognition. And we all remember that Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia had embassies in Washington between 1940 and 1991. Acknowledging Soviet Union, yes, controlling that territory, but never in terms of legally accepting that fact.
And very quick, right? Well, I hope you all got that, which is basically Mark Rutte saying, "Ukraine, you're screwed," which is the real language being used there, which is that Rutte acknowledging the reality that we've been talking about, which is they can't do anything to uproot the Russians from the territory they control. If the Russians want to claim the entire front line as it stands now, then they can do. If the Russians want to withdraw, they will do so only on terms that are favorable to them. And this is the reality that is now being slowly acknowledged certainly by some in the United States, Yeah, and Rutte, as he's just doing whatever the hell Trump tells him to at the moment, is acknowledging that as well. So the likelihood is now that the line of control will be whatever the Russians decide it will be. And then the Europeans, and because they are forced to by the Americans, will have to say, we acknowledge this, but we don't like it. That'll be it. Because there was no way that, as Rutte implies in his statement there was no way that the NATO could ever conquer the Baltic states back in the days of the Soviet Union, and there will be no way that they can take the new parts of Russia. So we go back to underhanded methods, terrorism, insurgency, attempted color revolutions. But unfortunately for the British in particular, the Russians have worked out how to counteract all of that now. The axe doesn't work anymore. To draw upon a point that Kit made earlier, and I think that we should in the future probably do a dive into the Helsinki Agreement of 1975 and what that meant. Because essentially what Putin has done slowly over the course of his term in office, he's actually undo the damage that the very foolish and counter-revolutionary decisions made by the later Soviet leadership did to the Soviet Union after 1975, which is allow the flooding in of these so-called human rights organizations, NGOs, etc., who laid the groundwork or helped lay the groundwork for the counter-revolution carried out by Gorbachev and Yeltsin, and who the Europeans and the Americans and the British later hoped would essentially provide the intellectual backbone for the sort of Yeltsinite comprador regime, which would allow them to keep Russia as a neo-colony. This all ended slowly during the Putin era. And again, this is why they were absolutely desperate to make sure that they got rid of him and the system he sits at the center of. But essentially what Putin has done is undo decisions going back to the Brezhnev era. And if you understand that, you understand why there is so much hysteria around the Russian system. For all the fact that it's a system built on Russian capitalism, in reality, as the war has gone on, what's been revealed is that the strength of it is actually the Soviet-era industry and the Soviet-era economic base that was built. And that Putin, to give credit where credit is due, not just him, of course, but there are many other factors involved, has actually preserved and started to extend. But Kit, throwing to you for final comment on the European naked emperors and the I know if you want to throw in anything about like Putin undoing the color revolution machine, which I would argue was set up via Helsinki in 1975.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's like, I mean, I as we've discussed before on this show, and I think that again, maybe we could just do a special on NATO expansion and the role of color revolutions and NED and the CIA and MI6 in this, is that like what I think that we are witnessing is that we're effectively we're witnessing the unraveling of a project that is many decades in the making. It might not be immediately obvious in certain cases, but ever since 1975, and particularly since the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe, the US has engaged in a very, very costly, time and energy intensive effort to hoover up every country in the region, one way or another, into its political, economic and military aegis, often against the explicit wishes of the overwhelming majority of the populations of these countries, often against the wills of elected governments, hence the need for color revolutions or NED skullduggery to ensure that they do the right thing. But I think that in the spirit of gradually then rapidly, I think that we're going to be seeing a lot more say Georgia style situations of governments stepping out of line
because it is fundamentally unsustainable. And we will also, as this lumbering beast that's been constructed in the shape of NATO and the EU starts to unravel, we'll probably also sadly see a lot more overt state repression as power structures desperately cling on. We are seeing this obviously we've discussed this about Germany. We are seeing this in the UK now with mass arrests of people for expressing support for Palestine action, in some cases when they are wearing T-shirts or holding signs that don't even mention the group. Like the empire is desperate and cornered and flailing and lashing out, not out of strength but out of weakness and fear. As unpleasant as it is to have to live through this kind of wave of repression, which will probably ratchet considerably, this is the end. Or at least it's the end of the beginning. In as much load as I am to quote Winston Churchill, but on that bombshell, I think this has been a great episode. Thank you so much, everyone who's tuned in. Please do like, share, subscribe, follow us on Twitter. Tell your friends, neighbors, relatives. But yeah, it's always a joy to bring you this information, as bleak as it often is, and we remain consistently thrilled at our ever growing audience. So thank you for believing in us, thank you for tuning in, and see you soon.
Thank you, everybody, and we'll be back with you next week. Until then, hold on to your hats. It's going to be a wild ride down the mudslide known as the fall of the Anglo-American Empire. We'll be back next week to cover it in painstaking detail. Until then, see you all soon.
Take care.